The crying had been going on for 3 days. It started before sunrise on the first morning, a high, sharp sound that rolled through the stone corridors of the palace like a wave. The guards on the outer wall heard it. The servants in the lower kitchens heard it. The old healers sleeping in their warm rooms heard it and sat up straight in their beds, knowing at once that something was wrong. The royal hatchling, Princess Sarah, was crying. She was small, even for a hatchling. Her scales were a soft gold color, pale and new, and her wings were still folded tight against her back the way young dragons carry them before they learn to stretch. She had hatched only 4 weeks ago, and in that short time she had been the joy of the entire palace. The dragon queen, her mother, had barely left her side. The royal attendants had taken turns holding her, singing to her, keeping her warm under enchanted blankets woven with heat spells older than the palace walls themselves. But now Sarah would not stop crying, and nobody knew why. By the end of the first day, 3 senior healers had been called in. They examined her carefully. They checked her scales for any sign of irritation. They pressed gentle claws to her tiny belly to feel for pain. They burned slow herbs in the corners of the nursery, herbs that were supposed to bring calm to any young creature. They sang the old lullabies, the ones that had worked on dragon hatchlings for 1,000 years. Sarah cried through all of it. By the second day, the crying had grown louder. It was not a sound that stayed politely in one room. It pushed through walls. It moved down hallways. Fine cracks appeared in 2 of the older stone archways near the east wing, the kind of cracks that took years of settling to form, now split open in hours by the sheer force of a small creature's grief. Candles flickered and went out when she reached the highest notes. Windows rattled in their iron frames. The dragon queen sat beside the crib through most of the second night, her great head lowered close to her daughter, speaking in the low rumble that dragon mothers use. It was a sound like distant thunder, warm and deep, and it should have worked. It always worked. Every story, every record, every elder the queen had ever spoken to said that the mother's rumble was the one true comfort for a distressed hatchling. Sarah cried anyway. By the morning of the 3rd day, the palace had taken on the quiet, strained feeling of a place where nobody had slept well. Attendants moved through the corridors with tired eyes. Guards stood at their posts but kept their shoulders tight. Even the large palace cats, who usually lounged in patches of sunlight without a care in the world, had taken themselves off to quiet corners and stayed there. It was on this same morning that the human trade delegation had arrived. They were a small group, 7 people in total, sent from a human settlement 2 weeks' travel to the south. They had come to discuss grain supply agreements, nothing complicated, just the kind of quiet trade talk that happened between the dragon territories and the human settlements every few years. They had been shown to the guest wing on the palace's far eastern side and told that the queen would receive them when she was available. Nobody had explained the crying. The delegation kept mostly to their rooms. They were polite people, careful people, and they understood well enough that something was happening in this palace that had nothing to do with grain. They ate the meals that were brought to them, spoke quietly among themselves, and waited. Among them was a man named Aaron. He was not a diplomat or a trade official. He was the delegation's cook, the person responsible for making sure the group had proper food during the long journey and during their stay. He was a plain-looking man, not very tall, with short brown hair and the kind of quiet face that people often forgot in a crowd. He did not speak much. He did not have strong opinions about trade agreements or political arrangements. What he did have was a habit of paying attention to things that other people walked past without noticing. On the first night, he had heard the crying through the thick guest wing walls and assumed it would stop by morning. It did not stop by morning. On the second night, he lay on his small cot and listened to it move through the stone like something alive, rising and falling, never fully stopping. He found himself thinking about it the way he thought about problems in a kitchen. Not with frustration. Just with quiet attention. He wondered what the hatchling needed. He wondered what had been tried. He wondered if anyone had thought to simply sit with her without trying to fix anything. By the third morning he had been awake since before dawn. He dressed early and made his way to the small side kitchen that the palace staff had allowed the delegation to use. He started a simple breakfast for his group, moving around the unfamiliar kitchen the way experienced cooks always do, finding things by feel and logic rather than memory. One of the younger palace kitchen workers came in partway through the morning to collect supplies. She was a small dragon, young, with dull copper scales and deep circles under her eyes from 3 nights of broken sleep. She did not say much. She gathered what she needed and turned to leave. Aaron looked up from the bread he was shaping. "The little one," he said quietly. "Is she all right? I mean, is she in any pain?" The kitchen worker paused. She seemed surprised that the human had spoken, and more surprised by the question itself. Most visitors, in her experience, asked how long the noise would continue, not whether the hatchling was hurting. "The healers say she is healthy," the worker said after a moment. "No injury. No sickness. She simply will not stop." Aaron nodded slowly. He looked down at the dough in his hands. "How old is she?" he asked. 4 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, more to himself than to her, 4 weeks is very young to be surrounded by so many people trying so hard. The kitchen worker looked at him for a moment, then left without answering. Aaron finished shaping the bread and slid it into the oven. He stood with his arms crossed, listening to the sound that came through the walls from somewhere deep in the palace. It was distant here, softened by distance and stone, but it was still there. Steady. Exhausted. The sound of something small that had been crying so long it barely remembered why it started. He thought for a while. Then he began to look around the kitchen, slowly and carefully, the way he always did when he was trying to figure out what to cook for someone he did not yet know. The third day stretched on slowly. By mid-morning, the palace had settled into a kind of exhausted routine. The attendants moved through their duties with heavy feet. The guards changed shifts without their usual brief conversations. Even the senior healers, who were proud people by nature and not easily discouraged, had begun to carry a look about them that was very close to defeat. They had not stopped trying. In the royal nursery, which was a large warm room in the heart of the palace with high curved walls and a domed ceiling painted with old dragon constellations, the work continued. The lead healer was an old dragon named by his title alone, Elder of the First Breath, a rank given only to those who had overseen royal hatchlings for more than a century. He was a serious creature, gray around the edges of his dark green scales, with slow deliberate movements and a voice like the creak of an old ship. He had never failed a hatchling before. He stood at the center of the nursery now, directing quietly, while 2 younger healers moved around the edges of the room placing smooth river stones in a careful pattern on the floor. The stones were deep violet in color, almost black, and they had been warmed in a special fire and rubbed with oil pressed from night-blooming flowers that only grew in the high mountain passes far to the north. The scent they released was soft and layered, something between rain and warm wood, and it was said to be the most calming smell known to dragonkind. Sarah did not appear to notice. She was sitting up in her crib, which was a deep bowl of carved stone lined with the softest woven materials the palace owned. Her small golden scales caught the light from the room's lanterns and threw tiny pieces of it across the ceiling. Her eyes were open and very bright, the deep amber color of new honey, and they moved around the room constantly, following the healers, watching the stones being placed, tracking the movements of every person who came near her. And she was crying. Not the wild, breathless crying of a creature in pain. It was steadier than that now, after 3 days. A continuous sound, rising and falling, filling every corner of the room and pushing out through the walls into the corridors beyond. It was the sound of something that had been crying long enough that the crying itself had become a habit, a constant state, a way of existing. The elder watched her for a long moment, then turned to one of the attendants. "Begin the second lullaby," he said. The attendant nodded and stepped forward. She was a middle-aged dragon with a gentle voice, well known throughout the palace for her singing. She began the lullaby slowly, the ancient words rising and falling in the formal rhythm that had been used for royal hatchlings for as long as anyone could remember. The melody was deep and circular, the kind of sound that seemed to curl around a listener and hold them. Sarah looked at the singer for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked away and continued crying. The elder said nothing. He turned back to the stones and made a small adjustment to their arrangement, moving 1-3 inches to the left with great precision. He stood back and examined the new pattern. Then he folded his hands behind his back and waited. Nothing changed. Out in the corridor, standing at a respectful distance from the nursery door, Aaron watched. He had not planned to be there. He had been making his way to the palace's eastern courtyard to collect some dried herbs from the supply chest the delegation had brought with them, and the route had taken him past this corridor. He had heard the crying getting louder as he walked and had slowed down without quite deciding to. Now he stood with his back against the cool stone wall, looking through the open nursery doorway at the scene inside. He watched quietly, the way he always watched things. Without rushing to conclusions. What he saw was a room full of people working very hard, all of them focused completely on the problem, all of them trying to solve it. The stones on the floor. The singing. The careful, deliberate movements of the elder as he made his adjustments. The 2 younger healers who stood ready at the edges of the room, waiting for the next instruction. Even the attendants who waited near the door were leaning slightly forward, tense and alert, ready to act the moment something was needed. Everyone in that room was trying so hard. Aaron looked at Sarah. She was not looking at the stones. She was not listening to the lullaby, or at least she was not finding any comfort in it. Her bright amber eyes were moving constantly around the room, from face to face to face, and there was something in that movement that Aaron recognized without quite being able to name. It was the look of a creature that was surrounded but not accompanied. Present in a room full of people but somehow completely alone inside it. She did not look sick. She did not look like a creature in physical pain. Her movements were restless, not weak. Her eyes were sharp, not glazed. She was alert and aware and unhappy in a way that had nothing to do with her body. Aaron stood in the corridor for a long time, watching. After a while, one of the door attendants noticed him. She was a younger dragon, broad-shouldered, with pale blue scales and an expression that had been worn flat by 3 days without proper sleep. She stepped out into the corridor and looked at him with the patient, exhausted politeness of someone who had already explained the situation to many people and was prepared to explain it again. "The nursery is not open to guests," she said. "I know," Aaron said. "I am not trying to go in. I was just listening." She looked at him for a moment. "The human delegation," she said, placing him. "Yes. I am the cook." He paused. "May I ask something?" She nodded, barely. "Has anyone tried just sitting with her?" he asked. "Not singing. Not placing stones. Just sitting quietly, close to her, without doing anything at all." The attendant was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that meant the question had landed somewhere unexpected. Then she said, carefully, "Every approach the elder uses has been proven over centuries." "I understand that," Aaron said. He was not arguing. His voice stayed even and mild. "I only wondered." Another silence. Longer this time. The crying continued from inside the room, steady and exhausting and very, very sad. The attendant looked back through the doorway at Sarah, then back at Aaron. She looked at him the way people look at something they are not sure about, weighing it without wanting to be seen doing so. "What would you do?" she asked. It came out quieter than she probably intended. Aaron thought for a moment. "Something small," he said. "Nothing important. Just something she has not seen before." The attendant rubbed the side of her face with one hand. She looked back into the nursery. The elder was repositioning another stone. The singer had moved into the third verse of the lullaby. Sarah was crying at exactly the same volume she had been crying at for the past hour. "Come back in 1 hour," the attendant said finally. "I will speak to the elder." Aaron nodded once. "Thank you," he said, and meant it simply. He turned and continued down the corridor toward the courtyard, already thinking carefully about what to bring. 1 hour passed slowly. Aaron spent it in the small side kitchen, moving with the calm and purpose of someone who had made up his mind and was no longer second-guessing it. He did not rush. He did not make anything complicated. Complicated was not what he was going for. He was going for something else entirely, something much harder to define but much easier to recognize when you saw it. He started with the bread. It was a simple soft roll, the kind he made for the delegation every morning. He mixed the dough by hand, the way his mother had taught him when he was very small, pressing and folding until it felt right. He shaped it into a round, smooth ball and placed it near the warm side of the oven, not inside, just close enough to rise gently without hurrying. While it rested he turned his attention to the honey. The palace kitchen had good honey. Dark and thick, stored in a wide clay pot near the back of the dry shelf. He spooned a small amount into a little clay dish and set it on the tray. He tasted a small drop from the spoon. It was sweet and faintly floral, the kind of honey that came from somewhere with a lot of wildflowers. He nodded to himself and set the spoon down. Then he turned to the dumplings. These were something he made rarely, only when the mood struck him or when someone on the delegation was feeling low and needed something cheerful. They were small and round, fried in a shallow pan until the outside was golden and just slightly crisp. The filling was simple, just a soft mixture of mashed grain and a little salt. Nothing remarkable on the outside. Nothing remarkable on the inside either, if he was honest. But they had a quality that Aaron had always quietly loved. When they were made just right, with the correct amount of filling and the skin fried to exactly the right thickness, they held a small pocket of air inside. And when you pressed one gently between two fingers, it made a sound. A soft, round, silly little pop. Not loud. Not startling. Just unexpected. Just enough to make a person blink and then, almost always, smile. He fried 4 of them carefully, turning each one with a small fork until all sides were evenly golden. He lifted them out one by one and set them on a folded cloth to cool slightly. He looked at them for a moment with his head tilted, the way a person looks at something they are quietly pleased with. Then he put 3 of them on the tray, ate the 4th one himself, and picked up the tray. He walked back through the palace corridors toward the nursery. The crying reached him before he turned the final corner, still steady, still filling the stone hallways with that continuous exhausted sound. He did not quicken his pace. He did not slow down either. He walked the way he always walked, at the same calm speed, the tray held level in both hands. The attendant with the pale blue scales was waiting near the nursery door. She looked at the tray. She looked at him. Her expression was difficult to read, somewhere between tired skepticism and something that might have been a very small and carefully hidden hope. "The elder has agreed," she said quietly. "You have a short time. Do not approach the crib directly. Do not make any sudden movements. Do not speak loudly." "I understand," Aaron said. "If she becomes more distressed, you will leave immediately." "Of course." The attendant looked at the tray one more time. "What is that round one?" she asked. "A dumpling," Aaron said. She said nothing further. She stepped aside and let him through the door. The nursery was warmer than the corridor and smelled of the night flower oil from the stones still arranged on the floor. The elder stood at the far side of the room with his hands folded, watching Aaron enter with an expression that was completely unreadable. The 2 younger healers stood near the wall. The singer had stopped. Everyone in the room was very still and very quiet, in the manner of people who are watching something they do not expect to work but are too tired to argue against. Erin looked at Sarah. She looked back at him immediately. Her amber eyes fixed on him with the sharp attention that young creatures give to anything new that enters their space. She did not stop crying, but for just a moment the sound shifted slightly, changed its rhythm by a fraction, the way a song changes when something unexpected happens nearby. Erin walked to the center of the room, not too close to the crib, not too far. He lowered himself to the floor slowly and sat down cross-legged with the tray in his lap. He settled himself comfortably, adjusted his position once, and then went still. He did not look directly at Sarah. He looked at the tray. He picked up the small bread roll and tore a piece from it gently. The sound of the bread tearing was soft and clean in the quiet room. He put the small piece in his mouth and chewed slowly. He tore another piece and set it on the edge of the tray. He dipped one finger into the honey dish and tasted it thoughtfully, the way a person tastes something they are genuinely interested in rather than performing for an audience. He was not performing. That was the thing. He was simply eating. Quietly and calmly and without any urgency at all, the way a person eats when they are comfortable and unhurried. Sarah was still crying, but she was watching him. Her eyes had not moved from him since he sat down. They tracked every small movement, the tearing of the bread, the dip into the honey, the way he set each piece down with care. Her crying continued, but it had changed again, become slightly less steady, interrupted now and then by a small pause as her attention caught on something he did. Erin did not rush. He ate half the bread roll. He had a little more honey. He set the bread down and looked at the tray as though considering his next choice. Then he reached out and picked up one of the round golden dumplings. He held it up for a moment between his thumb and two fingers, looking at it with a mild and friendly expression, as though it were a small and pleasant thing, which it was. He pressed it gently. The pop was small and round and very soft. A ridiculous little sound. The kind of sound that had no business being taken seriously by anyone. The crying stopped. It did not fade. It did not slow down and taper off. It simply stopped, the way a clock stops, all at once, leaving behind a silence so sudden and so complete that every person in the room felt it land on them like something physical. Sarah stared at the dumpling. Her mouth was still open from the last cry. Her small golden chest was still moving from the effort of it. Her eyes were fixed on Erin's hand with an expression of pure and absolute surprise, the expression of a creature that has just encountered something the entire world had failed to warn it about. Erin pressed the dumpling again. Pop. Sarah made a sound. It came from somewhere deep in her small chest and it was nothing like crying. It was bright and sudden and completely unguarded, the kind of sound that does not know how to be careful because it has never existed before. It rose up and filled the nursery and bounced off the domed ceiling and came back down again. It was a laugh. The first laugh Princess Sarah had ever made in her 4 weeks of life, pulled out of her by a small round piece of fried dough and a man sitting calmly on the floor who had simply decided to share his lunch. The elder of the first breath stood at the far wall and said nothing at all. Erin pressed the dumpling one more time. Sarah laughed again, louder, and reached out both tiny clawed hands toward him. The laugh changed everything. It moved through the nursery like warm air moves through a cold room, slowly at first and then all at once, touching every corner, changing the feeling of the place entirely. The two younger healers looked at each other. The singer pressed one hand to her chest. The attendant at the door took a small step forward without realizing she had done it. And Erin sat on the floor and smiled at Sarah the way a person smiles when something goes right that they quietly hoped would go right but were not entirely sure about. Sarah was still reaching toward him with both tiny clawed hands, her amber eyes bright and wide, all trace of crying completely gone from her face. She looked like a different creature than the one who had been shaking the palace walls for 3 days. She looked curious and alive and very, very interested in whatever this strange calm creature on the floor was going to do next. Erin pressed the dumpling one more time. Pop. Sarah laughed again and grabbed at the air between them with her small claws, trying to catch the sound as though it were something she could hold. She made a sound between a chirp and a giggle and rocked forward in her crib with the effort of reaching. The elder of the first breath cleared his throat quietly. He walked forward with slow, deliberate steps and stood a short distance behind Aaron, looking down at Sarah with an expression that had shifted considerably from the one he had been wearing an hour ago. He studied her carefully, his old healer's eyes moving over her with professional attention. Her scales. Her breathing. The brightness of her eyes. The way she moved. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the nursery without a word to anyone. Aaron did not watch him go. He was focused on the tray in his lap, tearing a small piece from the remaining bread and dipping it lightly in the honey. He worked slowly and without any show, keeping his movements small and easy. He held the small piece of honey bread out towards Sarah, not pushing it forward, not insisting, just offering it at a gentle distance and waiting. Sarah looked at it. She looked at Aaron. She looked at the bread again. She leaned forward very slowly over the edge of her crib, stretching her small neck out, her nostrils moving as she smelled the honey. Her expression was deeply serious, the way very young creatures look when they are making what feels to them like a very important decision. She extended one tiny claw and touched the edge of the bread piece with one careful talon. Aaron held perfectly still. Sarah took the bread. She pulled it back and looked at it closely, turning it over in both claws, examining it from several angles with great concentration. Then she put it in her mouth. She chewed once, twice, and her eyes went wide in a new way, a surprised and pleased way, and she made a soft sound in the back of her throat that was not quite a word and not quite a hum but something warm in between. She swallowed and immediately looked at Aaron's tray for more. He tore another small piece. She took it faster this time, with more confidence. By the third piece she was leaning over the edge of her crib toward him with both arms out and a very clear opinion about how quickly the next piece should be arriving. One of the younger healers made a soft sound that might have been a laugh quickly converted into a cough. Aaron was still sitting on the floor, still calm, still unhurried, when the attendant with the pale blue scales appeared at his shoulder and leaned down to speak quietly near his ear. "The Queen wishes to see you," she said. Aaron nodded. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with her bright amber eyes and the focused expression of someone who was not finished with this interaction and had strong feelings about interruptions. "Now?" he asked. "Yes," the attendant said. "Now." He set the tray carefully on the floor within Sarah's sight, stood up slowly so as not to startle her, and followed the attendant out. The corridor outside felt very quiet after the warmth of the nursery. The attendant led him through 3 long hallways and up a wide stone staircase to a set of tall doors carved with deep patterns of wings and flame. 2 large guards stood on either side. They looked at Aaron the way large guards always look at small unexpected visitors, with professional stillness and personal doubt. The doors opened. The throne room was enormous. The ceiling was so high that the top of it was lost in shadow. The walls were pale stone, carved all over with the history of the dragon royal line in long interlocking panels that reached from floor to ceiling. At the far end, on a throne that looked as though it had been grown from the rock rather than built on it, sat the Dragon Queen. She was large. Not the largest dragon Aaron had ever seen in drawings or descriptions, but large enough that the scale of her did not fully arrive all at once. It came in pieces. The length of her tail curled around the base of the throne. The width of her shoulders. The way her head, when she lowered it slightly to look at him as he approached, filled the space above him the way a storm cloud fills the sky above an open field. Her scales were deep gold, darker and richer than Sarah's pale new color, and her eyes were the same amber but older and much, much steadier. Aaron stopped at the appropriate distance and inclined his head respectfully. The Queen looked at him for a long time without speaking. 3 days, she said finally. Her voice was low and even and filled the entire room without effort. 3 days my healers tried everything they know. Everything passed down through centuries. Everything recorded and tested and proven. She paused. And you sat on the floor with bread. Yes, Aaron said. Explain this to me, she said. It was not a harsh command. It was a genuine request, asked in the voice of someone who truly wanted to understand something that had surprised them. Aaron thought for a moment before he answered. He wanted to say it correctly, not because he was afraid, but because it mattered and he wanted to be honest. Hatchlings are small, he said. And the world is very large and very loud to them. When something goes wrong and they cannot say what it is, everyone around them tries harder. More sound. More movement. More people. More remedies. He paused. But sometimes the thing they need is not more. Sometimes they only need something new. Something quiet. Something that is not trying to fix them. He looked at the Queen steadily. And someone who is not afraid of them. The Queen was quiet. You were not afraid of her, she said. No, Aaron said simply. She is 4 weeks old. She was sad and overwhelmed. There was nothing to be afraid of. The Queen looked at him for another long moment. Then she rose from her throne and moved past him toward the door without a word. Aaron turned and followed, understanding without being told. They walked back to the nursery together. When the Queen entered, Sarah saw her mother and made a bright sound. But she also looked immediately past her at Aaron, and her small clawed hands went up at once in the reaching gesture she had already decided was the correct way to request his attention. Aaron sat back down on the floor. He picked up the tray. He tore a piece of bread. He offered it. Sarah took it, chewed it with great satisfaction, and then did something that made every person in the room go completely still. She climbed. She pulled herself up over the edge of her crib with more determination than any 4-week-old hatchling had a right to possess, dropped the short distance to the floor with a soft sound, crossed the small space between them on unsteady legs, and climbed directly into Aaron's lap. She turned herself around twice, the way young creatures do when they are settling, pressed her small golden head against his arm, closed her amber eyes, and went to sleep. Just like that. 3 days of crying. 3 days of healers and lullabies and enchanted stones and ancient remedies. And the human cook sitting on a nursery floor with a tray of bread and honey was what finally, quietly, did it. The Queen stood in the doorway of her daughter's nursery and watched the small sleeping hatchling curled in the lap of a human she had met 10 minutes ago. Her expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then something in it softened, slowly and completely, like ice at the beginning of spring. She sat down on the floor beside them. And the nursery was finally, deeply, beautifully silent. Sarah slept for 4 hours. She did not stir. She did not whimper. She did not make a single sound that was not the slow, even breathing of a creature that had finally found a place to rest after a very long time of not being able to. Her small golden head stayed pressed against Aaron's arm, and her tiny claws were loosely curled against his sleeve, and the only movement she made in all that time was the gentle rise and fall of her small chest. Aaron did not move. He sat on the nursery floor with his legs crossed and his back straight and the tray still balanced in his lap, and he did not shift or stretch or do anything that might disturb the sleeping hatchling. His left arm had gone numb somewhere around the 2nd hour. He was aware of it in a distant, unimportant way and chose not to think about it. The Queen sat nearby for most of that time. She did not sit on the floor again after the 1st hour. She moved to a low seat that an attendant brought quietly and set beside the crib, and from there she watched her daughter sleep with an expression that was very private and very full. Now and then her eyes moved to Aaron, studying him with the patient attention of someone assembling a picture piece by piece. The healers had gone. The attendants worked silently at the edges of the room, keeping the lantern steady, keeping the temperature even. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to be the one to break the silence that had taken 3 days to arrive. When Sarah finally woke, she woke the way healthy young creatures wake, all at once and immediately ready. Her amber eyes opened, she lifted her head, she looked around the room with sharp attention, and then she looked up at Aaron and made the soft sound she had made the day before when she tasted the honey bread for the first time. Aaron looked down at her. "Good morning," he said quietly, even though it was afternoon. Sarah chirped at him and pressed her nose briefly against his sleeve. The Queen watched this and said nothing, but something moved across her face that was deep and genuine and not entirely composed. An attendant appeared at Aaron's side and helped him to his feet carefully, taking the tray so he could use both arms. He stood slowly, working feeling back into his left hand, and Sarah stood on the floor below him looking up with an expression of complete confidence that he was not going anywhere without her approval. He crouched down to her level. She looked at him very seriously for a moment. Then she reached out and patted his hand once with her small claw, with the firm and certain manner of someone concluding an agreement. Aaron smiled. The Queen rose from her seat. "Come," she said to Aaron. "Walk with me." They walked together through the palace corridors, the Queen moving slowly enough that Aaron could keep pace beside her. The guards and attendants they passed stood straighter and looked carefully at the human walking alongside their queen, trying to read in her expression what they were supposed to think about this. Her expression gave them nothing to work with, which in its own way told them everything. She led him to a long open gallery on the palace's southern side, a corridor with tall arched openings that looked out over the valley below. The afternoon light came in at a low angle, gold and warm, stretching across the stone floor in long rectangles. Far below, the valley was green and hazy with distance. They stood at one of the arches and looked out for a moment. "I want to offer you something," the Queen said. "In return for what you did." Aaron was quiet for a moment. "It was a small thing," he said. "It was not a small thing," she said. "Do not be modest in a way that is inaccurate. What you did required something that all my healers, with all their centuries of knowledge, did not have available to them in those 3 days." Aaron waited. "You were calm," she said. "Completely and genuinely calm. Not performing calm. Not trying to be calm. Simply calm." She looked at him. "That is not a small thing. That is a very rare thing." Aaron considered this. He had never thought of his own quietness as something remarkable. It was simply how he was. He had always been the kind of person who moved slowly through the world, who noticed things without reacting to them immediately, who found it easier to sit with a problem than to fight it. He had never imagined it would bring him to a dragon palace floor with a royal hatchling asleep in his lap. "I would like to give you a gift," the Queen said again. "Name what you wish." Aaron looked out over the valley for a moment. "Safe passage home for my people," he said. "All 7 of us. Through whatever roads your territory covers. A letter of passage so we are not stopped or questioned." He paused. "That is all I want." The Queen looked at him for a long moment. "That is all," she said. "That is all," he said. She was quiet. The afternoon light moved slightly as a cloud passed somewhere above. Then she said, "I will give you that. And I will give you something more, not because you asked, but because it is owed." She turned to face him fully. "There is a title in our royal record," she said. "Very old. Given fewer than a dozen times in the entire history of this palace. It is called Kindred of the Hatch." She spoke the words with a weight that made clear they were not ordinary words. "It means one who has been trusted by royal blood in its youngest and most vulnerable form. One who sat beside a hatchling not as a subject or a servant or a healer, but simply as a presence that meant no harm." Aaron listened without interrupting. "It carries no land," the Queen said. "No gold. No political authority. What it carries is this. Any member of your delegation, and any person you name in your lifetime, will be received in this palace as a welcomed guest. Not a visitor. Not a trade partner. A guest. She paused. And your name will be written in the royal hatch record beside my daughter's. As the one who made her laugh first. Aaron was quiet for a long moment. That is a very great honor, he said carefully. I am not sure I have done enough to deserve it. You have, the Queen said simply. I am not a person who gives things that are not deserved. Aaron nodded once. Then I accept it with gratitude, he said. And I will try to carry it honestly. The Queen inclined her great head. They walked back through the palace together toward the eastern guest wing, where the delegation was already beginning to prepare for departure. Word had reached them that passage had been arranged and they would leave the following morning. Aaron's colleagues greeted him with the mixture of relief and curiosity that people feel when someone from their group has been summoned by a queen and returned walking normally. He did not explain much. He rarely did. That evening the delegation packed their things and ate a quiet meal and went to bed early in preparation for the long journey south. In the morning they gathered at the palace's main gate as the sun was still low and the air was cool and the stone of the courtyard was pale in the early light. The gate was tall and carved with the same wing patterns as the throne room doors, and beyond it the road wound down through the valley in long easy curves. Aaron stood with his travel pack over one shoulder and his small cook's bag in his other hand. He had said his quiet goodbyes to the kitchen workers who had shared their space with him. He had left behind the clay honey pot, cleaned and filled again from his own supplies, on the nursery windowsill. He was about to step through the gate when he heard a sound behind him. Small feet on stone. Unsteady and quick and very determined. He turned. Sarah came across the courtyard at the fastest walk her 4-week-old legs could manage, which was not very fast but was extremely committed. She was clutching something in both front claws. The golden dumpling. The one he had left on the tray, the one that had made her laugh, kept now apparently as something worth holding. She crossed the courtyard and stopped in front of him and looked up. The entire palace had gone still. Guards at their posts. Attendants near the doors. The elder of the first breath standing at the top of the steps with his hands folded. The Queen herself, just inside the gate archway, watching without expression. Aaron crouched down in front of Sarah. She held up the dumpling toward him with both claws. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. He understood, in the way that people sometimes understand things without words, that she was not giving it to him. She was showing it to him. Telling him, in the only language she had, that she was keeping it. That it mattered. That he mattered. He reached out and pressed the dumpling very gently between 2 fingers. Pop. Sarah laughed, bright and full and completely unguarded, and the sound of it went up into the cool morning air and out over the courtyard and beyond the gate and down into the valley below. Aaron stood. He smiled at her once more, the same quiet smile he had given her on the nursery floor. Then he turned and walked through the gate and down the road with his delegation beside him. He did not look back. But he heard, faint and growing fainter as the road curved away, the small happy sound of a royal hatchling who had learned that the world contained things she had not yet seen, and that some of them were wonderful, and that the one who had shown her the first of them was someone she would not forget. Neither would the palace. Neither would the record. Neither, in the long and careful history of two peoples learning to see each other clearly, would the world.